Hello, everybody. I'm here today to talk about serial killers. Kind of a weird topic, but I'm home today just being a mom and doing some housework. And the other day, I was watching a documentary called The Toolbox Killer on Peacock. And as I was watching, my forensic psychology brain, that has studied forensic psychology for the last 10 years, was working overtime. So here are a few highlighted things from The Toolbox Killer, this documentary on Peacock. I wanted to talk specifically about how to not be a victim of a serial killer. And you might say, well, this isn't something that's happening in my backyard. But here's the thing. One thing that most serial killers have in common is that for a very long time period, they are not caught. So there could actually be somebody who lives in your town or who lives in your state or nearby city who, in fact, is, preying on people and killing them. And you don't want to be the next victim. So here are a few little things. We're going to start with the background of a killer. So in this documentary, here's some of the information about the Toolbox Killer. There were actually two. One of them was not really focused on in this documentary. He was mentioned, and a lot of his characteristics come across as being psychopathic. So the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath, in my opinion, and this is just from my research and experience, I've never actually had experience in person with a psychopath, but I have had experience with several sociopaths. So a sociopath is somebody who is a liar, very good at fooling people, a good faker. I'm looking at my notes because I wrote a lot down. Very good at manipulation. Will always look for access into your life or into the life of the people they want to victimize. Usually, or quite often, a sociopath can be a sexual predator. They will groom their victims. They can be very nice. They also, at later stages, will be very threatening. They might threaten with a gun or with a knife or with some other weapon. They generally have no conscience whatsoever. They are not bothered and they don't worry about the things they do to hurt other people. This is not something that is a concern for them. Doesn't keep them up at night. They are very good at making people like them. They're very charismatic, very social, and they do try to blend in. They basically will use people, but they do so in a way so that people don't realize they're being used. And again, I've had a lot of real life experience with sociopaths. Some have actually, a couple have been clients who have fooled me into thinking that they were victims of domestic violence and abuse when they really weren't. They were really the victimizing people. They were hurting other people. When I realized that that's what they were doing, of course, I stopped helping them because my goal and our goal at the consultancy is to help people who need a voice. We want to help people who, are desperately trying to survive situations where they're being victimized. So we're not going to help people who are hurting others. We're not going to help people who are victimizing others. We're just not going to do that. So a psychopath is quite often someone who's socially awkward. So what comes to mind for me is, Michael Myers and some of the other characters from horror movies. And, they're kind of standing with like that blank look on their face. Like there's nothing there. And they almost, look right through you, makes you feel very uncomfortable. They have no emotion. It just seems like there's a void there. Like there's just nothing going on there. That's a psychopath. They really don't have any ties. So my professor, my teacher, Dr. Eric Hickey, who is absolutely brilliant, he actually describes it this way. The sociopath still loves their mom. A psychopath doesn't love anybody and would kill their mother without even thinking twice. I probably should have started this by saying, trigger warning. We are going to talk about some stuff that is very triggering if you've been a victim, and probably not something that you should be watching if you're a kid. And I say if you're a kid because, some 13-year-olds are mature enough to talk about some of these things, while others would be, traumatized by talking about some of these things. So I'm going to try to keep it PG-13 and not rated R. If you do have questions or concerns about specific things that might be a little bit more rated R and you want to know, I probably have an answer. So feel free to message me on the consultancy page or on my personal page. That's Roberts Michaels Consultancy or Marsha Roberts Michaels on Facebook. And, send me your questions. Very happy to answer and talk to you about what I can and what I know about and what I've experienced. Okay, so the case on the Toolbox Killer, this video is going to be a little bit longer than we've had in the past. Basically was a situation where a young boy was born to a domestic violence home. He was abandoned by his mom, and you can hear when he speaks later, he really blames her. He was a victim of abuse himself. The person that he lived with was a family member after his mom, abandoned him. And this person was physically abusive with him, definitely kind of, tortured him. And so later he goes on to torture animals. And of course, his guardians have no idea that he's doing this. They're not paying attention. So I'm just going to tell you a little story about my kids. Two of my kids, when they were little, actually took a baby bunny out of our rabbit cage and they put her in a nearby pond and they were drowning her. And because I'm a really, I don't want to say picky or strict, but I'm a very involved mother, I noticed right away what they were doing. And I ran over and I rescued the rabbit and, sort of revived her, did like rabbit mouth to mouth. Like we actually revived her and we, got her warm and we blow dried her to, warm her up. And she actually didn't die from the drowning. She did pass away a few days later from pneumonia, which was just because her little bunny lungs couldn't handle all that water. But I spanked both of my children. And it was not of anger. After the little rabbit was saved and she was warm, I took them aside and I said, I love you both very much, but we don't hurt little creatures. We don't hurt small animals. And so mom is going to spank you so that you remember that we don't do this. You don't ever put a living animal underneath the water and hold their face under the water because it will make them die. And we don't want to hurt or kill other living creatures. So, I was very clear, wasn't angry, but I loved my kids and I wanted to make sure that they knew this was wrong. So the Toolbox Killer, his guardians had no idea. He was never reprimanded or anything. So he began, like many serial killers, to not respect the sanctity of life. And where this leads to down the road is that it's very easy for him to kill young girls, teenage girls particularly. So as time goes on, he escalates and he becomes a peeping Tom. But this was all of these things were sort of done in secret because in his school life, his academic life, he was a very good student. He had a very high IQ. He had good grades, and you never would have suspected that this was going on or that this was what this kid was doing. So I'm a substitute teacher. This would be the kid that probably sat quietly in the corner and did his work, and I never had to speak to him and could leave good notes about him to his teacher. So nobody really knew that this is what was going on behind closed doors. So as time goes on, this guy, he escalates to stalking. So he's locating women that he's interested in, and he begins to stalk them. He also begins to light fires. Arson is very common for serial killers. For this particular person, I think he really wanted the attention of his guardians, who were not giving him any attention. So because he began to light fires, he ended up in a youth detention center, and then later he went on to prison. It was in prison where he makes a friend who is a psychopath. And the two of them begin to watch movies and craft fantasies about what they're going to do to young girls when they get out. And eventually they do get out because their crimes, one of them actually had been convicted for rape. But in our society, we don't send people away for very long for rape. We send them away even less time if they've raped a wife or an intimate partner. Stranger rape will get you, a few years in prison, and that's exactly what happened. So when they got out, they bought a van, and they began to stalk and plan and kill teenage girls. And these girls were like 14, 15, 16, 17, all underage. So this was something that was kind of like their MO. So some things characteristics of the crime and of these men. Strangulation was huge. Strangulation was the way that most of these women were killed, or most of these girls were killed. And we see strangulation a lot in domestic violence as well. And, when we look at, is your domestic violence is your intimate partner dangerous? One of the questions we ask is, are they strangling you? Are they putting their hand on your neck? Because if they are, they're a dangerous perpetrator. It never comes to any good. What ends up happening in an intimate partner relationship is that there's a loss of control, and eventually they go too far and they kill you. So if you're in a relationship and that's going on, it's not a good thing. It's not going to end happily, and you need to get away from this person who has this bad habit of doing this to you, because your death could occur. Either accidentally or just because they lose control in anger and frustration, and, they strangle you a little bit too long. But in this case, strangulation was how they killed the victims. They were also both sexual sadists, which means they got off on screaming and pain. The sex was non-consensual. That also excited them. Their favorite tools to use to torture women were things out of their toolbox. And this is how they got the name the Toolbox Killer. So pliers, an ice pick, screwdriver, a sledgehammer. They also like to take photos of their victims. They used Polaroid, so they didn't have to have anybody, see these pictures. They were just for their pleasure. And you can guess what they used them for later. They also made recordings. They also used these as trophies. And they committed the crimes in areas of isolation, so up in the mountains. So we see a lot of these things with DV perpetrators as well, which is the area that I work in the most often. A lot of times there are forced nudes taken of girls or women. The women are smiling in the pictures. I remember when I went to court for my situation, the judge said, oh, well, or no, maybe it was my ex's lawyer said, well, you're smiling in the picture, so obviously you liked this and you were consenting. That couldn't have been further from the truth, because there are threats that are given to make sure that you smile. Okay, I see that my time is short, so I want to end. I don't have very long. I might have to continue this in another video. I didn't realize it would take me so long to talk about this. Why don't we title this Part 1? And this is the background of a serial killer. All of these things are patterns that we see consistently over and over again with serial killers and domestic violence perpetrators. We see the same things. I'm going to continue this in a second video, and I will talk to you about how to avoid being a victim in these situations.